This program is brought to you by the Forbes-featured Freedom Hub Health Plan, the alternative to overpriced and restrictive insurance. The Freedom Hub Health Plan is exactly what you need. By Frequency Medicine Associates, supporting health professionals and laypersons with safe and effective advanced telemedicine-like technology that can scan and help rebalance the root causes of stress and illness. By the Planet Lockdown film, which can be seen on the Freedom Hub's Rumble channel along with many great speakers. And by The Pavilion, a 21st century community hub that brings together many of the disruptive innovations featured by the Freedom Hub, including direct pay healthcare, farm-to-table dining, TED-like Freedom Hub talks, and more. Visit your-mp.com/pavilion solution for details. Welcome, everyone, to another Thursday Freedom Hub Working Group podcast, Zoom, whatever we want to call them these days. There are a lot of names, I suppose. I'm Jim Greatpack, joined by my co-host, the man, Charlie Froman. And if you're new to the channel or just tuning in or watching this on a replay for the first time, let me show you our website and how you can see what's going on, sign in, etc. And you are going to, if I got this working right, go to your-mp.com on the internet and click over to your media hub. And I will say, take a look at your health, your wealth, your marketplace. We have some good solutions there for health, wealth, and freedom, which is what we're about. So click on your media hub, and that's going to take you to the page which connecting you with innovators and free thinkers. Wednesday's talk is really generally in the health biz, cash market, cash patient, direct primary care, that sort of thing. We're breaking the mold, coming up with innovations and innovative people we're showcasing. And then today is Freedom Hub. You can subscribe here. We recommend that, so you do get the mailings and you'll be alerted to who's coming if there's somebody you like or some topic. A little bit of the topics and bios here. And then down at the bottom, we have our listing of the channels where we post, generally by the Monday of the next week. So you can go to BitChute, Brighteon, YouTube, when we're not censored there, and Rumble. So they're right here. Click through. Hopefully soon we're going to put up a list of our past speakers on the website to make it easier for you to kind of check through. And let me, with that, wish you a great day and turn this back over to Charles.
And thanks, Jim. And folks, the website that Jim can put in chat there of our page is your-mp.com. And keep in mind, you could help us by supporting our sponsors. And Forbes did feature the sharing that we're selling as opposed to health insurance, which does create cash patience and helps the market by stirring that price-sensitive shopping, without which you can't really solve healthcare's problems. Now, as Jim said, the Thursday show, this one, is broader than the Wednesday one, which is focused more on health disruption. This is about liberty in all aspects of liberty: regulatory capture, empowering our entrepreneurs. And, you know, apologies off the bat here in my promo, I didn't mention the elephant in the room when it comes to disaster response, and that is the Ohio train wrecks and the release of toxins and the government suppression of what's going on, or the real slow response. And, you know, that event is well timed for today's topic because it really will allow us to go into the discussion about, could free markets do a better job responding to that man-made disaster, or even the natural disaster that Florida suffered. And by the way, Jim, my family had a little condo in Fort Myers in the late 70s that we would go to at Thanksgiving. And if you look at the videos on YouTube of the Fort Myers wreck from that hurricane, that very high class strip of land is gone. All the buildings were flattened and flooded and ruined, including the building where we had a condo. So, you know, we were gone several decades by the time that happened. But I think that really was the genesis for today's show as we schedule way out in front, because Robert Wright, an economist, former teacher at the New York U Business School, Temple, UVA, Virginia, and well-published author in all these econ journals and history journals, wrote an article about whether the private sector could do a better job than the government in responding to these disasters. And 20 years ago, when I was a lobbyist or congressional staffer on Capitol Hill, I happened to meet the director of the National Flood Insurance Program, just a family friend. And I think folks should know, if they don't, that I think that's one of the biggest offenders in today's issue. And that if you're rich, the government subsidizes your insurance for the risk of flood. And what does that do? That leads you to more easily afford and choose to buy a second home on the beach. And so taxpayers are subsidizing the rich with a government insurance program for flood risk. And then if there's a disaster, FEMA comes in to clean up the mess. Then HUD has a program for builders. It's probably as rife with corruption as any other HUD program for rich builders and apartment complex owners. And then I guess, just like we had a couple weeks ago with the CPS family law problem, there's the federal subsidies involved with something called the Stafford Act, which is the spigot for all the state-funded recovery from disasters. So with that, Robert, I will turn it over to you to explain why this should be an important issue. I think folks are worried about more and more disasters of an expensive nature, and we need to get a handle on this before we run out of money. Go ahead, Robert.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm feeling a little under the weather today, but I'm going to hopefully share the correct screen. How does that look?
Looks great.
No, I think that's your other screen. That's yeah, try again.
We'll try that.
There you go.
Okay. Did it advance?
Yep.
All right. So this is an important topic because there are lives at stake here. Obviously, there's also a tremendous amount of money and resources, and we all know that lives cannot be replaced, but we rarely stop to consider that money and resources are also irreplaceable. Once they are used for one thing, they're not available for another. Economists call this opportunity costs. So when an entity like a government needlessly wastes resources in one emergency or disaster response, that means those resources are no longer available to aid victims of other emergencies or disasters. So it's important for us to make the disaster response and emergency response work as efficiently as possible. So for a concrete example, there was a hurricane that hit Puerto Rico. There was an oil tanker that happened to be nearby, and that fuel could have been diverted to Puerto Rico to help with the disaster response there. But there is a very old law in the United States called the Jones Act that prevented that oil tanker from landing in Puerto Rico and giving aid to the people there. That means extra resources were required to get oil to Puerto Rico, and those resources, therefore, were not available to help victims of later emergencies and disasters like the people in East Palestine, Ohio, for example. Now, some people might complain that I've conflated natural disasters and human-made emergencies. But the two aren't necessarily as distinct as is often assumed. For example, a wildfire, right? Wild, natural, might actually be the result of arson, and hence have a component that is more human-made than man-made. And of course, we know that things that are definitely, so far as we know, caused only by natural earth processes like earthquakes, are the impact of those events are impacted or exacerbated or can be exacerbated by things like building codes. So the two things are not as distinct as some people would make them out to be. So the general idea of my talk is to discuss a couple of concrete cases of PER, private emergency response. But I just want to make it clear what some of the major takeaways are, and so that's why I built this little chart here. The idea is that there is a history of private emergency response. It's not a new idea. If anything, instead of talking about privatizing emergency response, we should be talking about reprivatizing emergency response. There's a history of private parties or a combination of nonprofits, charitable responses and commercial responses from like insurance companies, sometimes with incidental government assistance, but not primarily government-led efforts to bring physical aid to the victims of emergencies and disasters, things like food, water, fuel, medical aid, rescue resources, and so forth. And also financial response from the charitable and insurance sectors, paying for the aid that's provided in the immediate aftermath, and also for longer-term reconstruction efforts. There's a theory of private emergency response, and it is part of the larger public choice literature in economics or School of Economics, and it points out that those providing aid get aid too. They get something in return. Insurers, of course, get money. The government gets power, and charities tend to get some of both when they respond. The key is really to figure out the incentives to reduce the frequency of bad events, and when those occur, to minimize their costs, right? Because no matter what we do, bad stuff is still going to happen. The questions, the difficult questions are things like, how do we handle it when individuals or groups are unable to pay for insurance, or they're unable to pay for the cleanup in the aftermath of a disaster or of a human-made emergency, right? Because if they can't clean up, that can lead to what economists call negative externalities, or bad stuff, for other individuals, like disease and rats and all of that stuff. Another difficulty that needs to be minimized is the politicization of responses, which we might have seen occur just this past month in East Palestine. So how do we move from the system we have now, which is sort of a hodgepodge of public-private, towards more of a pure private emergency response? Well, one thing is, to talk about the possibility of expanding the private side of emergency response, to try to reduce that status mentality of assuming that only the government can provide, sufficient responses. And so I give talks like this one and write articles like mentioned earlier. We can also then more concretely move on to trying to prevent government from crowding out private emergency response. This happens because the government sucks resources, money, and people away from the private emergency response, and also minimizing or trying to break down costly regulations that prevent private emergency response from being as effective as it could be. There are various regulations regarding insurance that I'll get into, and also laws like the Jones Act, which I mentioned previously, and also so-called price gouging regulations that can be quite pernicious and really hurt the private emergency response efforts. So one of the cases is the Johnstown flood of 1889. If you're not familiar with this, over 2,200 people were killed below a dam in western Pennsylvania after it burst during a heavy rain. So again, there's that combination of human-made and natural disaster. The dam just didn't burst. It wasn't just an engineering issue. It was a combination of a natural event with human decisions. About 1,600 homes were destroyed, and $500 million in today's dollars in total property damage was caused, where this massive volume of water came very quickly down through narrow valleys in western Pennsylvania. There were whole towns and families that were literally wiped off the face of the earth from this event, right down to the bedrock. Everything was stripped. It was horrific. The response was almost entirely private and amazing. The American Red Cross, which of course is a charity, right? It's a nonprofit, was a major player. So were some major Pittsburgh area corporations, and about 7,000 volunteers showed up, mostly from the U.S., but even some from some other countries, to act as undertakers and carpenters and food distributors. Some nearby municipal governments got involved, and money poured in from around the world in response to this event. Now, the problem was that nobody possessed sufficient incentive to prevent the dam from breaking. The dam owner, under the legal theories at the time, didn't have any legal liability for what happened, and the value of the lake to them was minimal because it was used only for recreational purposes. It was a fishing club that owned it for some rich Pittsburgh folks and whatnot. The residents below obviously had some desire that this dam wouldn't break, but they faced the collective action problem in that everyone wanted the dam to be safe, but they also wanted somebody else to suffer the costs involved in that. Federal government officials were not really involved in any way in this one. This is the 19th century. The federal government was still pretty much sticking to, its original limited purview. The municipalities that survived the flood, ironically, gained in power from it, as did state officials. And I'm not saying that they sat around and they said, "Oh, we can't wait for that dam to break, so our power is going to go up," or anything like that. But they did not have a strong incentive to try to prevent it, because when it happened, then they were able to step in and pound their chests and show that public face, like they actually did something. Same thing with charities gained power. The American Red Cross, gained immensely from this event. The life insurers, insuring the lives of the people who died, they also faced a collective action problem. In that there were thousands of insurers in the U.S. at that time, and none of them had a significant number of insureds in that valley. which help them to avoid any major solvency issues or profitability issues from this. But that, in a sense, was the problem. They didn't have an incentive to make sure that dam didn't break. And the same thing with the property insurers, interestingly enough, because in the 19th century, in property and casualty insurance was still highly regulated to the point that what's called monoline insurance was still prevalent, which meant that there were fire insurers, right? And they insured against fire. They did not insure against floods. And even to this day, there are some legal or regulatory restrictions against what are sometimes called all perils policies, of writing a policy that protects people from any bad event that might occur. Flood insurance, of course, is notorious because you can pretty much tell which areas are going to be flooded and which aren't. So there's a huge selection issue, or adverse selection issue, as economists call it, that makes it very difficult to insure just for floods. But if it can be combined with other types of insurance on fires and avalanches and meteor strikes and what have you, it would be much more possible to create an incentive for property insurers to make sure that major physical events like this, or like the train derailment that just happened in East Palestine, which is not all that far away from this event, actually, do not occur. So the theory is, if you have stronger incentives, you're going to have better outcomes. I mentioned that fire insurance was a main industry in the 19th century, and in fact, fire insurers worked together to stop the nation's citywide conflagration problem. Multiple cities over a couple of centuries in the United States either burned completely to the ground, or large districts within them burned to the ground. Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, and Nolens, and New York, and Savannah, and San Francisco, and lots of others. So what the insurers did was they got together, created a consortium to develop fire retardant protocols and materials and architectural styles and all sorts of things. And then they rebated the premiums of those businesses and those apartment buildings and so forth that implemented these fire safety measures. And it worked extremely well to stop these citywide fires from recurring. And there are other stories in other industries, like marine insurance was another main and very, very clear industry in the 19th century. And so in the shipping industry, the insurers got together and said, hey, look, we're going to rebate your premiums if you only hire sober captains, right? Not the drunkards. If you hire qualified pilots to make sure that your ships safely get through the dangerous areas outside of many of our major points, then we're going to rebate your insurance. They got together to provide firefighting ships. So in case a ship caught on fire, another ship would show up and put the fire out. They provided lighthouses and foghorns and all of this other sort of safety equipment that, and again, all of this reduced the probability of there being a major disaster or emergency, and also kept the costs down when one of these events happened. And of course, stuff, I say, you can well imagine a different S word, but it still happens. It can happen no matter what. This is a personal story for me. This just happened in a town called Sea Isle, a few miles from my house. I don't know how well you can see this, but the upper balcony fell onto the lower balcony, and it crushed a construction worker named Jose in the process. And my wife happened to know this individual as well. So I investigated what happened. It turns out the building's insured. The building has government inspectors. There was homeowners insurance that covered the resident temporary relocation down a couple of years ago. So they evacuated everyone in the building. They are now, living outside, but their homeowners insurance is covering it, and it's off season now, so it's not super duper costly. It turns out that Jose's life was not insured.
Robert, can you hear me?
Charitable groups are stepping up, and yes.
Can I interrupt you a second? We're kind of losing you. You said your internet might give you trouble. Maybe you could just turn your camera off, keep the, and that'll help on bandwidth, and we can keep going with the slideshow, and maybe repeat a little bit about this event, because we lost you there.
Okay. Let me figure out how to do this.
At the bottom, just stop video. I think that should do it.
How's that?
Yep, perfect. Now, hopefully that'll help. Or maybe
Okay.
not. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an example of something that just happened in Sea Isle City. My wife happened to know the victim. Everything was insured except for the life of the victim. So charity is steps. It's remarkable because there was a time in the U.S. when but because of over regulation and other issues, apparently not all adults have life insurance in their through their employment, and this is obviously something that we need to address, because life insurance is one of the core pillars of this private emergency response system that we could have. It's only going to work if most people have sufficient insurance to cover their families if something like this when something like this happens. But the other reason I bring this up is because it points to why we cannot really leave disaster response to government. It's just too important, right? The public choice theory predicts that government officials are going to respond to emergencies in ways that help them rather than the victims per se. So nobody in the government cares about what happened to Jose, right? It's just one guy and one apartment emergency. At the other end of the spectrum, big disasters, you might get Trump showing up and throwing paper towels or distributing his own branded water or whatever, but not sufficient preventative investment, right? That's really the key in things with like hurricanes. You need to have robust infrastructure that's going to minimize and be redundant and things like that. But government doesn't really have the incentive to make those sorts of those sorts of investments, because what kind of headline is it to say, oh yeah, there was this hurricane, and yeah, oh by the way, hardly anyone died, and property destruction wasn't all that high because we made investments that prevented it. And then you have these intermediate sized emergencies like in East Palestine, and these might be subject to what's called purple bias. So the idea is that if the place is full blown red, like East Palestine is, and there's a blue administration, they might not respond with much alacrity, because they know they're never going to get the votes of the people there anyway. Another possibility is that you have a very blue district and a blue administration, and the response is the same, because those folks are going to vote blue no matter what, right? So the whole thing can become politicized, and the people living in the purple districts, which might flip one way or the other, might be the ones to get the most effective response from the government, as horrible as that is. So on the concluding slide here, how do we reduce barriers to private emergency disaster response system? It's worked in the past, could do so again in the future, especially if people understand that there is a private option. And if we can keep the government from crowding out private responses with its own agencies like FEMA, and especially if the government doesn't increase the cost of private emergency responses with unnecessary insurance regulations, or things like the Jones Act, or these anti-price gouging laws that many states, especially in hurricane zones, have implemented. The high prices for water and blankets and food and so forth are really crucial signals to what is needed and where. And when we have any price gouging laws that have any sort of teeth to them, we lose those signals, right? If the government shows up and starts distributing water where it thinks water is most needed, it might not be the place where it's most needed, but the people there have an incentive to overconsume it because it's quote unquote free. There's somebody on the back of a truck passing out water, for example, or passing out blankets, and yeah, I'll take those, when really maybe 2 miles away is where they're most needed. But there's no prices involved, so we shackle ourselves by turning disaster areas into many socialist or communist states with command economies, instead of allowing prices to reflect where water is really needed and where electricity generation is most needed, and so on and so forth. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Good work.
And should I turn my video back on?
You can try, sure.
Give it a shot.
And Charles has something to say, so Charlie,
Well, it's a question. And folks, if you have a question, please click the raise hand icon under the reactions tab, which you'll find around the Zoom controls. And Charles Ford, I saw a number of chats from you that are really interesting. So if you want to raise your hand, those are some good questions too. Also in chat, folks, I put a link to a YouTube recording we had years ago at Freedom Hub with Joe Kent from the think tank in Hawaii on the Jones Act. Over 5 years weekly, we always seem to have touched the subject before. So that shocks me, Robert, that there are, I guess, state regulations against all peril protections with property insurers.
Yeah, isn't that something? The insurance industry is overregulated in so many ways. I don't purport to understand all of it because I'm not in that industry, but especially when I taught at Stern, I had plenty of students in the industry, and we started calling them insurance garkets instead of markets. Kind of a portmanteau between government and market, right? Garket, because there's so many regulations involved, and that is the real Murray Sabrin right there. I figured it was you.
That is a great word, Robert. Garkets. That is so accurate. I'm licensed to sell health insurance, but I don't sell it because it's got networks. It's so overregulated and distorted. Sharing is better. As Murray might agree, since I helped him with his recent book on healthcare for groups. But that's a takeaway right there, Robert. Thank you. Garkets. So accurate. Jim?
Oh, yeah, sorry, Murray, yeah, you're in the limelight.
Unmute myself.
There you go.
See you, Bob. Looks like you're a Viking fan wearing the Minnesota purple.
Oh no, it just
NYU's color is also purple.
is it?
Yes, yes. I was a big NYU basketball fan back in the 1960s when they were doing fairly well. Anyway, great to be with everyone. Charles, thank you for all your input for my latest article that hopefully will be published next month in California about healthcare strategies. And the older I get, the more I realize what a ripoff insurance is. And Bob, you're probably familiar with David Beato's book about mutual aid societies, which I think is the way to go. I mean, we can get rid of Medicaid and most of these social welfare spending if we go back to the original vision of America of mutual aid societies at the local level. And this is what Bob has been written about. I've been writing about. I've been writing about, and I think we need to have a full-fledged assault on the welfare state and talk about all issues are local. They're not national, they're local. And the other issue, and since I'm in Southwest Florida, which was hit hard by the hurricane, and my sister-in-law lived on Sanibel Island, not far from Fort Myers Beach, which was ground zero for the devastation of the hurricane, we have a moral hazard problem, don't we? People are living in areas that they should not be living because of the high risk. And that's why there aren't private insurers for these locations. And the federal government steps in with their flood insurance. And you create all sorts of incentives for people to live in probably the most risky area in the country, which is the coastlines of Florida. And so I don't know how we change that. We have a governor that seems to be proactive, but he too has bought into the notion that government aid is necessary to make people whole in hurricane-stricken areas. So I'd like to get Bob's take on this whole concept of moral hazard and why disasters have been occurring not so much more frequently, but how the economic incentives make government involvement almost an imperative in our society.
Yes, good point. And I don't know if you had joined the call yet, but Charles did an excellent job in the introduction talking about the moral hazard involved. And, I see it as part of a bigger problem where so much of higher education, where we're supposed to have independent thought leaders, coming up with ideas and sharing them with students and discussing them and so on and so forth, has really just become so one-sided. So I'm thinking of this book by David Moss, When All Else Fails. Did you happen to see that? He's a professor at the Harvard Business School. And it came out 15, 20 years ago, and it just lauds the notion of the government as an insurer of last resort.
Yeah.
And he's a smart guy and he understands these moral hazard issues, but he's more like, we can just afford it, right? We can just hand waving sort of thing, without coming right out and saying that essentially, we are subsidizing our wealthy people by doing this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I invited John Stossel many years ago to speak at the college, and he said he was one of the beneficiaries of, I think, flood zone insurance, federal flood zone insurance, as the subsidy to upper income folks. And he certainly is one of the upper income folks in the media. So again, people know this and they game the system because if the federal government is going to throw money out to people who engage in risky behavior, why not take the money? I mean, it's silly not to, but there's no incentive, as you say, for eliminating these programs, and that's why we're stuck with them for the time being. There's no magic wand to get rid of it because part of our culture right now is what? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the welfare state. So we've got a lot of work to do. Bob, keep on pumping out those books and articles.
Thank you. I'm about a mile from high tide here in South Jersey, and so I was able to get a real mainline insurer that I'm sure for my house that I'm sure you've all heard of. But when I owned a condo over in Ocean City, a half a block from the Atlantic Ocean, I tried to get homeowners insurance for this thing. And I kept running across all these little companies that I had never heard of before. And I started looking them up on AM Best and discovering that AM Best didn't cover them. They were all covered by a company called Demotech, I want to say. And so I looked into Demotech, and it turns out they just rate insurance companies that are essentially just paper. They're just reinsurance contracts. They're not real. They're not real. Companies with assets in the United States. So I ended up insuring that place with Lloyd's of London. Yeah. So I'm afraid that there are a lot of people who think that they have insurance along the coast, and they're going to find out that they don't. And when they get or don't have anything, all that solid. And when the next big one hits and, they can't pay off their mortgages, that there's going to be yet another federal bailout.
Yep.
Oh, man. I was just going to say before Jimmy bring other folks in that you mentioned Medicare, Murray. It sounds like we have the same dynamic with Medicare and National Flood Insurance. It's a welfare program for the wealthy, and those are the hardest to get rid of.
Well, if Warren Buffett wants to pay more taxes, he should go off the Medicare and Social Security rolls. That's my mantra. Let all the wealthy people show what they really believe in terms of higher taxes by not putting a burden on other taxpayers and paying their own way. So I've been making the case for that in my Substack column. So I'll just continue to do that, and hopefully some of the media that I've been interviewed on will pick that up as well.
All right, great. Let's move on to Charles Ford.
Good morning. I almost don't know where to begin, but I'm going to start with the Johnstown flood. It's ironic that the dam that collapsed was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, and the bridge that acted as the clog that caused the flood to recycle and recircle through the city and kill most of the people and do most of the damage was also owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. So my point is that it's just ironic when you think about East Palestine, Ohio, that also was a railroad company as the cause. There has been subject about something called a moral hazard. I want to sharpen some iron for just a moment. A moral hazard is where you buy insurance with the idea that you're going to use it and burn the building down or something like that. That's a moral hazard. A morale hazard is because there is insurance, you become indifferent to the risk of loss. And what he's really describing is a morale hazard. I also want to make a political comment that's economic in nature, and that is, if you choose to live on the coast, expect to lose everything once a generation. And if you're not willing to do that, don't live there. That's the bottom line. It is not my responsibility, much less a government's responsibility, to subsidize your choice to engage in that. If you wish to fund that with insurance, let's first define what the word insurance means. Insurance is the operation of the law of large numbers through risk pooling. So you and the other people along the coast from Bangor, Maine to Brownsville, Texas, can band together, form a risk pool, You've got a some certain loss each year, that's your problem. And if a reinsurer wants to be involved as a third party, good for them. But it is not my responsibility to subsidize your lifestyle along the coast. Sorry, I do not take any responsibility for that. And until we address that, I don't think there's going to be any improvement in the response to these disasters, because let's face it, most of the people in this country today have an idea that when something bad happens, they hold their hand out, tilt their head back, and open their mouth. They're entitled victims. And that's the problem we have in this country today. We have 3 generations of occupants that assume that they're just want to be entitled victims. I mean, that's all wokeism is we're entitled victims. So as long as we have that mindset collectively in this country, I don't see any improvement in anything that's going to happen. Going back to poor old Jose, there's a couple of insurance things I want to just mention in passing. Number one is, if the place was insured properly, and I can assure you it probably was not, the liability would work as follows. You know, Jose should have work comp, hopefully, and they weren't using him as an uninsured sub or an uninsured person. So that pays his death claim, his benefits, and so forth. Secondly, the owner and the contractor should have had what's known as a protective policy, which would have covered the subcontractor against Jose being hurt because what they were working on fell on him and killed him, and also the building owner's vicarious liability for the action as well. Probably not carried, probably not done correctly, because it's sold through agents, and agents are only in one business, and that is to make commissions at your expense. You mentioned Demotech, and that's really interesting. They're on the coast. Basically, you made the right move, probably going to Lloyd's. But understand this, prior to 1986, Lloyd's Insurance said, we have never defaulted. That was their business model. Today, the model says, trust us, this time we'll actually pay the claims. So, understand that's what you're dealing with. One last comment about the insurance industry is that you have to understand who builds the stuff on the coast, who makes the mortgages, who is the source of the funds. It is the insurance industry. So guess what they do? They use the NFIP to do what? Promote more development on the coast and get the government to pay the claims for a flood when it happens. That is so corrupt. Let me give you one example of how this system is so corrupt. When they have a hurricane, the FEMA people work with the NFIP people, with the insurance adjuster standing there, and they put a stake in the line and said, everything towards the coast from here over is flood, regardless. Everything from here over, we're going to call wind. Would you like to guess which way the industry gets that line drawn? It is not to the benefit of the NFIP or the insurers or the American taxpayer. That's the control they have. The insurance industry is nothing but a global cartel that is run by the central banks with interlocking board of directors. That's all it is. They control everything through allocation of risk. The one last comment about your comment about all peril. You can get all perils. And in fact, in every country, in the civilized country in the world, earthquake and flood is no problem to insure as part of a basic policy. It is only in the great United States of America that we have this problem. So, you want to solve that problem? Let's bust the cartel. Let's do away with McCarr and Ferguson antitrust, and let's get back to actually having a marketplace. And one last political comment, and then I'll shut up. The reason the industry is the way it is today, you can thank Ronnie Reagan for that great Republican. And we don't have time to get into that today. He destroyed the American industry of insurance. He destroyed American ownership of the capital of insurance. We are now nothing but a bigger nation in the insurance world. All our companies and all our reinsurers are owned by foreign companies. We are no longer, except with one exception, State Farm. State Farm being a mutual hasn't yet been sold out, but everybody else has been. So when you look at all these problems and you then apply them to what you're looking at on the coast, it makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for all that.
Wow.
Charles. Yeah,
That was great, Charles.
maybe you should have Charles present.
He did. He has a
He
book
did.
on the
okay.
haiku of corporate corruption.
Yeah, and we're certainly aware of some of those issues. I believe that's why Murray brought up David Beto's book and referenced earlier style insurance or risk sharing arrangements.
Mutual aid.
Are not so corrupt. And I happen but I am with State Farm at this point after having left the coast proper. So thanks for all that.
All right, I think Linda and then John.
Yes, I am from Greece. Just to mention that 2 days ago, we had an accident like in Ohio. 2 trains collide, one cargo and one passenger train. And so far, we have over 60 deaths.
Well,
All the others are in hospitals, passengers. The person responsible for the accident, for the control of the railroad, is in jail, and the Minister of Communication resigned, and he's going to court. So the other thing is the whole country is mourning this, is in grief and mourning this accident with so many deaths, and lack of good, how do you call, I cannot find the word. Anyway, all conferences, lectures, and everything have been canceled to participate at the grief in the morning. Now, I close this parenthesis to tell you, here in the United States, when you see, for instance, in California, on top of the mountains, one fire, and 5 minutes later, next mountain, the same fire as another fire, and a few minutes later, another fire, is not by chance, is not by anything else. It is made, man-made things. And when you see all those, how do you call, chemtrails in front of my balcony on the 9th floor, I see spraying constantly. I take pictures. I have to give you hundreds of pictures how they do all that. How are we allowing all those things to happen and not take some measures, but really very bad measures, like to spray what? To spray with the chemicals, all the ministries, all the officials. I don't understand what we have to do.
thank you, Linda. Let's
I
see if
am in
Robert
despair. Finish.
has any, huh? Okay, Robert, any
Yeah,
response?
I actually heard about that that tragic accident in Greece just before this, and you know, couldn't really work it into the presentation, and of course, you know, there were many lives that lost there. But even in the United States, when there have been many lives lost in Amtrak derailments, we just keep going right along with the same old. And of course, you know, Amtrak's a major cluster and has been for a long time, and is you know, an example of Garkets, like I mentioned earlier, right? We destroyed passenger rail in the United States, and then the federal government comes into the rescue, but it was the federal government's fault for why intercity passenger rail had reached the point that it had to be bailed out or nationalized or done away with, or better yet, those regulations removed. And as far as forest fires go, those are an excellent example of how even if it's caused by a lightning strike, it still has a very large policy component. Because somehow the government got it in its brain that it's best just to leave forests alone. And over decades, they just start to accumulate more and more combustible material. And then when a fire starts, it you know, becomes this massive thing that can't be easily stopped. Where previous governments and even you know, Indian tribes used to clear out the underbrush with controlled fires and with controlled logging and you know, firewood extraction and so forth. So I hear you, and we probably have time for one more.
Yeah, John G.
Hey, hey, Jim and Charles. I'm actually in Cape Coral, Fort Myers right now. So I got to thank Charles Ford for the subsidies. But we we just been through the hurricane. Well, property, I mean, insurance is a lot higher here to, I guess, reflect some of the risk. But a couple of things. One is I work for a storm restoration company, which is kind of interesting. But also, people are real disappointed with FEMA, or whatever expectations are raised for FEMA through the response we just had. In that, there are people, a lot of people right now in tents, with their families and living under bridges that were in Fort Myers Beach before. So that's the problem. Supposedly was because it's in a flood zone, FEMA wouldn't put trailers there. And I know one instance they put a trailer in someone's yard for them, but they never set it up so they can actually move into it. Well, because their house was gone, things like that. But anyway, I work for One Source Restoration part-time. It's a good company where we're hired on during storms by electrical companies like Con Ed at one point, or anyway, different power companies throughout the East. But I've gone out to many storms and not done anything. I'm supposed to watch for wire downs, so stay on a wire that's down, or drive an assessor. But it turns out that the power companies need to have a lot of response ready just in case it's needed. So let's say I'm out 5 times doing it for several days. I've maybe only worked a few hours. So I thought the irony is people, sorry about the wind, it's picking up. People see all the trucks, the power trucks coming into the site, for different states. You'll see them on the highway, big convoys of power trucks coming in, and they're always so thankful. They're like, oh, those people are amazing. But they are making a mint, right? I'm sure it's a big part of their income, So you have people basically praying for storms, and then you have people praying not to have storms. But I don't know how that fits in, but the talk is very interesting. A lot of things I didn't know about the whole industry and a lot of good insights. So thank you for that.
Robert, doesn't that get into your last century insurance conglomeration theory that when the private insurers get together, they prepare and prevent disasters, like with the ships and the fire ships and all that? Is that kind of what he's giving an example of with the power companies getting ready for the disasters?
Yeah, to some extent. And of course, like I said at the end, we shouldn't begrudge anyone for making a profit from this. This is just the market signaling, as long as it's done on the up and up and in some competitive fashion, right? It could also be all rigged behind the scenes. But if there's a dearth of a certain type of labor or material there, then and a high demand for it, then the price should be high. But it's a self-correcting issue, right? Because more and more resources will pour in until the price goes down for the labor or for the the materials needed to reconstruct. So I'm not so worried about that, especially if insurers are paying for it, because presumably they will pay attention to the costs of things. But as Charles pointed out, we do have some problem with corporate corruption and so forth. And I'm also reminded in the 19th century that many railroads, for example, the executives owned companies that were supplying goods to the railroad and used it for what's called asset tunneling, or taking the resources of the railroad and making it their own. So yeah, there are no panaceas, but I do trust market competition a lot more than I trust political administrations, left or right, to be frank.
If I could briefly say, in our case, the power companies are paying us. So I don't know that they do with the insurers, but I'm sure it gets passed on to the local consumers in their model. And if they didn't pay enough, they wouldn't have the people. So yeah. I think the market will balance that out. It helps us a lot, but if I wasn't getting paid more, I wouldn't spend days and days without power somewhere to try to help them. It's very rigorous.
Right. My mother and brother live on the Space Coast, and one of those older homes. I think it's called the Redneck Riviera or something. But the some insurer, I don't know if it was that Florida thing or consortium or whatnot. They're not very clear on it either. But some insurer said your premium is going to go way up unless you do A, B, C, and D. And so they did all those things when normally they wouldn't. But when those hurricanes came through there, they had no damage whatsoever. So there is a real world out there, and there is rationality or reason, right? We don't have to just be passive victims of evil people or random events. We can foresee some things and take steps to try to lessen their impact.
Robert, we're out of time. Why don't you give us a final thought, paint a picture of America under a private disaster response system? What is the upside if people take seriously this recording and care about this issue? What are the benefits? And then tell folks how they can contact you and say goodbye.
You can reach out to me at the American Institute for Economic Research, just at AIER.org. Check out the website. You can find me on there, and lots of ways to connect via email or Twitter or what have you. There's no panaceas. I'm not going to say that the world suddenly is a utopia after that. Just like I started that first slide with, if we don't waste resources doing some of the dumb things that we do currently, we'll have more resources available for other things, for helping victims of events like East Palestine, or we could also spend the money on other things like paying down the national debt, or building another aircraft carrier, whatever floats your boat.
And you can be reached at, is there an email or something, or?
Robert, on Twitter, it's at Robert E. Wright. That's probably the easiest way. If you're not on Twitter, I don't blame you. Then just Robert.Wright at AIER.org.